Liberalism section. Liberalism, property-owning individualism, and aristocratic society. In an attempt to overcome the difficulty encountered in defining 18th and 19th century British society, reference has sometimes been made to individualism rather than liberalism, and the history of the intellectual tradition being examined now seems profoundly stamped with a property-owning individualism, or possessive individualism. This definition has some legitimacy. In Locke, political power begins to be configured as tyranny, and hence violence, when it attacks private property, belonging to the dominant class. And it is then licit to resist such violence. The citizen, in fact the individual, takes back the power he already possesses in the state of nature, which consists in, quote, using such means for the preserving of his own property as he thinks good and nature allows him, end quote. The sphere of legality is the sphere of respect for private property, while violence is defined in the first instance by its violation. On closer examination, however, the category of property-owning individualism proves completely inadequate. We are confronted with a society and intellectual tradition which, far from being inspired by a superstitious respect for property and property right in general, in fact promoted and legitimized massive expropriations of the Irish and Indians. It is true that a central chapter in the second of Locke's two treatises of government bears the title of property, but expropriation might have been more fitting, given that it aims to justify white colonists' appropriation of land from idle Indians incapable of cultivating it. Ignoring the colonies and colonial populations, or populations of colonial origin, the category of, quote, property-owning individualism seems to focus attention exclusively on the white community in the capitalist metropolis, and on the conflict between property owners and non-property owners. Even if we confine our attention to the metropolis, we see that the second treatise justifies and demands the enclosure of common land in England, and hence the massive expropriation of peasants. Like the transatlantic territories occupied by the Indians, common land was not properly fertilized by labor, and hence in both cases there was as yet no legitimate owner. In classic authors of the liberal tradition, we find the assertion and detailed demonstration that the property claimed by natives and by social groups in the metropolis assimilated to natives was in reality res nullius. Paradoxically, despite its critical intentions, the category of property-owning individualism ends up crediting the ideological self-consciousness of the classes that arrived in power in England and America, advancing the slogan of liberty and property. Marx argued quite differently. Capital denounced the, quote, stoical peace of mind of the political economist and of the liberal thinkers in the face of, quote, the most shameless violation of the sacred rights of property and the forcible expropriation of the people, end quote, carried out in England. In the early decades of the 19th century, in order to speed up the enclosure process, brutal methods were sometimes employed without hesitation. Entire villages were destroyed and razed to the ground, so as to force the peasants to flee and transform common land into private property and pasture in the service of the textile industry. In examining the category of property-owning individualism, we have hitherto concentrated on the adjective. If we now turn our attention to the noun, we shall find that it too proves rather problematic. The excluded were likened by the dominant class to instruments of labor, bipedal machines. In other words, they saw their quality as human beings and individuals denied. Certainly, the privileged insisted strongly on this quality, which they attributed exclusively to themselves. But is this individualism? Here too we find the modern historian aligning himself with the ideological self-consciousness of a social class and political movement he intends to criticize. Rather than, quote, property-owning individualism, the categories applied to England by some leading liberal authors of the 19th century seem more apt. In Constant's view, quote, England is, at bottom, simply a vast, opulent, and vigorous aristocracy, end quote. The judgment formulated by de Tocqueville in the 1830s was no different. Quote, not only does the aristocracy seem more solidly stable than ever, but the nation leaves the government, seemingly without any signs of disapproval, to a very small number of families. An aristocracy primarily based on birth, end quote. Hence we are dealing with an aristocratic community, characterized by the domination of, quote, a small number of powerful and wealthy citizens. Besides, it was Disraeli himself who criticized the Whig Party, which long dominated the country that emerged from the Glorious Revolution, for having aimed to establish an aristocracy and oligarchy on the Venetian model. End of section.